Alex,
Yes, Todd.
this is the last week of the year.
It is the last week of the year.
So, what is your New Year's resolution? For the podcast, we'll say,
They
because there's
say
a lot of things.
for the podcast, I don't know. I've been a good year so far, other than we had a bit of a break in the middle of the year. So that'd probably be the biggest thing is try to minimize our long breaks like that if we can, or at least plan ahead better.
Yeah,
Probably be the better thing. But that was kind of a special situation because
yeah, I don't see that
Yes.
happening again next year.
no, definitely not. So, but I'm just excited to my New Year's resolution is that we get through the fish before the end of next year.
That's a good one. We should. We honestly should. I look at that chart quite a bit, and we should be fine for it.
Yeah, but then the problem is then we got to hit the amphibians, and that's going to be
That's gonna take as long.
horrific.
Because for at least for the vertebrates, I'd like to keep doing what we've been doing, where we kind of like go more in depth. And we've been doing a good job at that so far in the fish worlds.
Yeah.
But let's get started for the day. As always, I'm Tyler, and that's Alex,
Hello, everybody.
and we're back for another week of Life the Complete Story. So we'll start how we always do, Nature in the News.
Yes,
Today's article comes from Science Daily. It was published by the University of California, Riverside, and they found a way to remove toxins from potatoes and tomatoes. So if you don't know, raw potatoes aren't exactly safe to eat. They kind of have some toxins in them that make people sick when they eat them raw. And that's more of a self-defense mechanism that the plant has developed over time. So we've found a way to like genetically modify them so that they don't produce these chemicals. These are called steroidal glycoalkaloids. A glycoalkaloid would be the sciencey way to say it, I guess.
Yeah.
Commonly known as SGAs. And like when you see the green parts of potato peels, that's really what that is, as well as like the sprouts, like the eyes in the potatoes, I guess.
Yeah.
So these SGAs are like the main repellent of insects. So potatoes are like root vegetables. So like grubs and stuff will get to them, and like gardens and farms and stuff. So we have engineered the plants to control when and where the SGAs are produced. So they'll be produced more in the leaves than the actual tuber themselves, which is what we eat.
Okay. The only problem with that though is like when you're growing them, it makes them much more susceptible to like those,
Right.
like whatever's in the ground that's going to eat them.
Yeah. So you have to be more aware of that stuff.
Yeah, and it looks like they kind of did the same thing in tomatoes. So they're primarily in the unripe fruit as well as the leaf stems, roots of the plant. Now, of course, there are things that it doesn't bother them to eat all that, like the hornworm will absolutely shred a tomato plant. But it looked like they were able to silence the Game 15 gene, a protein gene that eliminates SGA production in the plant. But the problem is it made it highly susceptible to pests. So that's something that, and the biggest issue with this toxicity is if something like you store them on your counter, they get exposure to sunlight, then that's where this concern really becomes a problem. And then as well, they're thinking in the future, if we eventually do get to a point where we either like space travel is a thing and they use things like potatoes that are a really good high density nutrient food, but then they want to be able to eat all of the plant. You don't just waste half the plant by not eating the stems and leaves. This is where something like this would become real big, or like vertical farming systems where you need to maximize space.
Yeah, this seems like one of those things where at the time being, it's great in like in a lab tested like concept, but it's not really ready to send out into the field yet.
Yeah, because of a lot of those issues with the pests that are now able to eat a lot more of the plant all of a sudden.
Right. So, kind of a small article. The main topic is we're using gene inhibition to kind of like turn off these genes that make the SGAs in certain parts of the plant and really enable like turn them on in other places. Right, Alex?
Yeah.
But once again, that was published by University of California, Riverside, by Adam Joswiak, Cyantan Panda, Ryota Akayama, Ayano Yaneda, Naoyuki Umamoto, and about 12 other people.
Yeah, there's quite a number of folks, quite a very diverse group of individuals who are working on this. So very cool.
Without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump right into our lesson for the day. Kind of a small one. We're only covering one group. Last week we covered two, but this week we're going to be covering the Elopiformes. So these are originally from the Jurassic period, and their main difference from other teleosts is they have an additional set of bones in their throat. And in your adult forms, they have like a herring-like appearance, whereas the juveniles are more eel-like, long, slender individuals.
Okay. Yeah. So the big thing with this group is, at least nowadays, there's only two families still existing, the Elopidae and the Megalopidae. So these are primarily saltwater fish, but there are some freshwater. They live you find the same species in both. The Elopidae is primarily known as the Ladyfish, and the genus that goes with that, I think it's about 6 species, 6 or 7. And then Megalopidae is also a monophyletic family where there's only one genus, which has 2 species, and those are the tarpon. So very closely related. They look very similar. Of course, the Megalopidae, the tarpon, are much, much larger than the ladyfish, but otherwise they kind of both are, as far as body style, body plan, kind of how they grow and adapt is very similar.
Right. So, Alex, would you like to start with the Elopidae?
Yes, sir. If you give me one moment here, I'm going to pull up a
Picture.
pictures. Yes, sir. Share this tab. Here we go. So that is our tarpon. So we'll start with them. I'm going to do the notes backwards and drive Tyler crazy.
It's okay.
So this picture specifically is the Atlantic tarpon, which is one of our 2 species, of course. It contained, of course, within that genus Megalops, which we typically call the tarpon. Both of the species, the Atlantic and then the Indo-Pacific tarpon, found in marine and freshwater habitats. They typically ascend rivers to reach like freshwater marshes. They're very adaptable. They can withstand a lot of pH levels and salinity, as well as low oxygen levels. They're actually able to use their swim bladder to suck in small gulps of air. They live fairly close to the surface, so they're able to kind of intake a little bit of air from the air and get it into the swim bladder and use it almost like similar to a lung, not quite the same as when we talked about the earlier, forget the group that we talked about a few weeks ago, that actually it was a lung. This is still a swim bladder. It's just kind of a in between. That's a good way to put it. The habitats vary a lot from the developmental stage to the adult stage. A lot of that has to do with where they're at, kind of how closely they're to the shore. A lot of these live, like we said, close to shore where they can get into freshwater habitats or saltwater habitats like salt marshes, tidal pools. Your stage 1 larvae, like and when they first hatch, they're typically in those nice, clear, warm oceanic waters, fairly close to the surface, because a lot of them, the larvae are very small and actually clear. They almost look like
If you guys remember from way back when.
Yeah.
Back in March, maybe.
Yeah. And then as they grow a little larger and get more to that like fry stage where they look a little more like the fish, they kind of move to like salt marshes, tidal pools, creeks, rivers, so those warm, shallow bodies of water that tend to be a little darker with kind of those muddy, sandy bottoms. And then they will commonly ascend rivers into fresh water for food and I'm guessing shelter as well, especially if the ocean water is getting pretty rough, like if there's a storm or something. But most of the time they return to those ocean open waters, but some of them do actually remain in that freshwater habitat through those different developmental stages. That first stage, they really don't forage for food. They actually do what is called integumentary absorption. So they absorb nutrients through their skin from the seawater because they are so small and thin. But then as they get larger, they feed on typically what you expect tiny fish to feed on, zooplankton, small insects, smaller fish. And then as they get larger, they move more into the larger insects, fish, crabs, grass shrimp, because they're in some of those freshwater environments. And then the adults are strictly carnivorous, feeding what is called on midwater prey. So they're going to be kind of not shore edge, but fairly close, kind of not quite open ocean, kind of that littoral zone, I think is what it's called.
Like around the continental shelf, kind of.
Yeah, and a little closer to shore. And they're typically nocturnal, but not always. That's usually where they hunt, and they swallow their food whole. So actually, when I was in high school, I had an opportunity to go to Florida, and off of a fishing dock, you're actually able to buy like cut pieces of fish and feed tarpon off the dock. It was pretty cool. But they would jump up. They don't have teeth, really. Like a lot of fish is more of just like a kind of a bony plate or like a ridge around the lips. But they would actually jump up out of the water a good couple feet and or a good foot or two, and almost get most of your arm into their mouth as well as the fish that they're trying to eat. When they're small, most of the time their main predators are other fish, depending on how big they are. But as they get to the juvenile and larger stages, juvenile stage, it tends to be other juvenile tarpon, as well as fish-eating birds like osprey and some of the other raptors, because as they come to the surface, and they tend to do kind of like a roll as they come to the surface, so the silver scales lining like the sides of the body kind of reflect, making them easy targets. And then the adults, just because they're much larger predators like sharks, porpoises, crocodiles, and alligators. So as I said about that swim bladder, of course, as addition to buoyancy, it is that accessory respiratory organ, like similar to a lung. So it actually comes off of like the throat, like the esophagus where they breathe, and it is that where next to that part of the esophagus is coated with a lot of very thin capillaries that allow it to absorb oxygen similar to the way that a lung does. So they're able to use it, and they can stay underwater for a long time, or like we said, live in those very oxygen deficient, kind of stagnant water areas, such as those mangrove marshes and marsh ecosystems that they kind of use as nursery habitats. They can even survive into like ponds during things like very high water events like storms, or what is called a king tide. So they will live in those ponds for a while, pretty much until they get a chance to get out of them, which is good for the juveniles because it gives them a pretty safe area to grow. Problem is they need that atmospheric oxygen to breathe. They retain that ability into adulthood to breathe that air, which makes them probably why they're able to survive things such as like ocean, like the oceanic dead zones that arise from
like red tides and stuff.
Yes, like red tides, where you get that influx of like fertilizer from river systems, which then causes a massive algal bloom. And that's not the part that's the problem. It's after that, when all that algae dies, and the oceanic, like for the fungus and the as it breaks down, it gives off a ton of CO2, pushes out all the oxygen in that area, and then basically just makes it a big dead spot where nothing can live. And as I said, they are, because they live fairly close to the shore, and they, as I said, they jump. They're considered one of the best saltwater game fishes to catch because they get pretty large. Your typical Atlantic tarpon can get up to, what I say, 2.5 meters in length. So that's a little over 8 feet. And they can weigh about 160 kilograms, which is about 350 pounds. Those are some of your largest. But typically, especially the males tend to be smaller. They rarely weigh more than 100 pounds. And it is said that the Atlantic tarpon evolved about 18 million years ago. So they are some of the oldest living fish that still exist. But getting back to what I was saying before, with their relation, they are very fun to catch. And I did not have the opportunity to catch any when I was in Florida, but they're fun to see. They jump very high and they fight a lot. Makes them exciting to catch for fishermen. And the advantage is because they are really not desirable to eat, most of them are released after they are caught, which helps their populations. But their biggest threat to their population is the decline of freshwater rivers flowing into the seas, especially around Florida, which is where a lot of them live near the United States. And a lot of that is, of course, human intervention, putting in dams, draining swamps and marshes, things like that for development. But the Indo-Pacific tarpon tends to be a little bit smaller, only about 1 meter in the saltwater, kind of when they live in the saltwater, which is they get larger than the freshwater ones. The freshwater only get about half that size. And which that's about 3.5 feet in length for the largest. But they can live a fairly long time, about 44 years, maturing after about 2. So they get through that, and they get through that larval stage in about 10 days. Get from that hatching to being an actual fish fairly quickly, but it takes them a little while to get to a mature tarpon. Anything else you want to add, Tyler?
No, not for the tarpon. I'll go ahead. I'll take over as we talk about.
Yeah, and here's your Indo-Pacific tarpon. They tend to be a little darker, as we said, a little smaller.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I'll start talking about the Elopidae. So these are going to be the smaller versions. There's one living genus known as Elops. These guys have the common names Ladyfish, skipjacks, jackrashes, and 10-pounders. They're coastal dwelling fish. They're found throughout tropical and subtropical regions, and they occasionally move over into that temperate water outside of the tropics. They spawn at sea, so they'll lay their eggs at sea, and then when they hatch, those larval stages will kind of migrate back towards the brackish pools, or even like some. Most of the time they eat smaller fish and crustaceans, mostly shrimp, and they're a lot smaller than the tarpon, typically about 3 feet long and only about 22 pounds.
So about 1 meter, 10 kilograms. That's a large one. And that's for across all 6 species as well.
Right.
Not just one of them gets that big or stays that small.
Yeah, so that's like an average that's like the larger average between all 6 species. They have a tapered body shape, which helps a lot for like hydrodynamics and stuff. They are kind of, which I'd say they're faster swimmers in terms of marine fish.
Yeah, they're pretty fast. And I did actually have an opportunity to catch fishing off the coast of Florida, and it is very fun. Since they're a lot smaller, it's a little less work than trying to catch a 300-pound tarpon, but they're actually referred to as the poor man's tarpon because they still jump and fight like one. They're just
like a tenth the size.
They're much, much smaller.
And they have adipose eyelids that partially cover their eye, which are very large for fish. They have that eel-like larvae similar to the tarpon. They're transparent ribbon-like, and then they'll eventually grow into that fry form. Similarly, these guys are sport fish, but they are released soon after catching because they are very bony and it's just not a good fish to eat. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
7 species.
7 living species.
My picture must be missing one.
Yeah. There's the Pacific ladyfish, the Hawaiian ladyfish, the West African ladyfish, the 10-pounder, the generic ladyfish, the Senegalese ladyfish, and the Malacho. So the Pacific ladyfish lives in the Pacific Ocean, obviously. They're pretty round-bodied. The gill formations are pseudobranchiae, which would be like false lung, right? If you translate that.
Yes, think so. Yeah, it's like false branching. So I'm not 100% as to like how their gills would look compared to other fish. Usually, you get like multiple layers of very finely folded gills. That I'm not 100% as far as how that branching would change.
This species does not have the conus arteriosus, which is a band of tissue where the pulmonary artery comes from. So because of this, the pulmonary artery is a lot smaller than most other vertebrates, and they have an unbranched lateral line. They have silvery cycloid scales. So cycloid scales are what you think of most often when you see a fish scale. A kind of like roundish, overlapping one compared to the ones that you see on the gars and bowfinch, which are more like diamond shaped, connect. They're not overlapping, they're more connected.
Yeah.
And these ones are found off like the Pacific coast of the U.S., mostly like Arizona, New Mexico, California. Next is the Hawaiian ladyfish, obviously found around the areas of off the coasts of Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean. And they use like the hypersaline lagoons around the area as like their main habitat, but they can often shift between habitats, whether it be more coastal or even like an estuarine marsh in the area.
Yeah, and it's possible that this species is actually multiple species as well. I'm sure that there's a lot of, being like the Hawaiian Islands, Pacific Islands, there may be some, as they've isolated from each other for long periods of time, they may be becoming their own species.
Right, which is something you see quite often, honestly.
Yeah.
Just separation of populations that eventually they become genetically different enough that they are their own species. Next is the West African ladyfish, found off the coastal waters of the Atlantic Ocean, typically along the coast of Africa from Senegal to Angola. They've also been known as the Ghanaian ladyfish, and they can grow up to about 20 pounds. And if I'm looking at this illustration, the one that looks the most like this is the top left one.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well. I mean, as you can see in the illustration, as we're going through the list, the illustration doesn't match how we're reading them.
Yeah.
It's an example of all of them. As you can see, they all look very similar. A lot of just some minor differences as far as fin shape and coloration. Those are really the main differences between them. They all share just about the same body plan and shape and everything.
Next is the 10-pounder. This one would probably be that bottom right, if I'd have to guess, just based off coloration and fin shape and everything else.
It's a little more downturned on the face as well.
Yeah, these are found in coastal regions of the Indian Ocean, India, a lot of Southeastern Asian countries, even into some Middle Eastern countries.
Many of these share those qualities that we started with the Hawaiian ladyfish, where they really like those estuary and hypersaline lagoon areas because they're some of the few species that can survive in those areas. So it makes surviving there a little easier, but like a lot of those river delta things like that are becoming developed and urbanized, and they're losing habitat.
Yeah, next is going to be the Elopiformes, or the generic ladyfish.
Yeah.
It's not really localized to anything in specific. These guys are distributed in the Atlantic Ocean from New England to Florida, also the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
And this one would probably be,
I think, like your middle right one, I think.
yeah.
They're very shiny. They got the very silvery, shiny color.
They got a very silvery, shiny color. They got a really, like, vertically condensed face. And like it's same as everything else, really. They're one of the only species that can survive in some of those hypersaline areas. We have the Senegalese ladyfish, which is kind of like has an overlapping territory with the West African ladyfish. They kind of inhabit like the Atlantic Ocean, coast off the Atlantic Ocean of Africa, really from like Mauritania to the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's often confused with the West African ladyfish, but it can be distinguished by only the number of gill rakers on the lower part of the first gill arch. So, to the common eye,
They're
they
going to
look
look
exactly the same.
You'll have to really like pretty much just like actually catch one and kind of pull that gill plate back a little bit and try to count, which at that point it'd be pretty tough. Most common fishermen are not going to care.
Right.
They'll just say, "Oh, it's a ladyfish."
And last is the Malico, or the southern ladyfish. They kind of live in the Caribbean all the way down to Brazil. So the Bahamas, a lot of those Caribbean islands, stuff like that. But like once again, they spawn at sea and then kind of go back into those freshwater, brackish water areas. And they follow the same similar plan of every other ladyfish we've talked about so far. Do you have anything else to add, Alex?
I really do not. I mean, like we said, a lot of them, they're very similar, and a lot very similar. Pretty much all have the same kind of habitat, just spread out throughout the globe. So I'm sure at some point the southern ladyfish or the Senegalese ladyfish were probably considered like a subspecies of like the regular ladyfish or the West African ladyfish. So that may be why some of these there's only a few pictures. And actually the southern ladyfish was very recently identified as its own species. So it's probably why there's only 6 images here, is because it was considered the Elopiformes, which is just ladyfish, for such a long time.
Yeah, we're talking 2010, which is still 14 years ago, but in the terms of like taxonomic identification, that's really
very
recent. Considering
the
we're only
ladyfish
identifying a couple species a year.
The ladyfish and the 10-pounder were both identified back in the mid-late 1700s, and with the rest of them in the mid-1800s, early 1900s. So it's very, very recent compared to the rest of the species within this genus.
Right. All right, Alex, I'll pass it back over to you so you can cover your most wanted for the week.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now this we'll switch a little bit from our tarpon here, and we will go to another type of fish, which is called the mosquito fish. So this image I have pulled up here, they look very similar to the guppy. They are this fish specifically is the western mosquito fish, which is native to North America. So which is why it's kind of just known as the mosquito fish or the gimbezi. But there is also an eastern mosquito fish. And the image I have pulled up here is a female. The male is a little more slender and darker. But the big thing with these, why they are invasive, is they've been introduced to a lot of areas, as their name suggests, to control mosquito populations. However, this has become kind of a problem because in a lot of those areas, they're very difficult to control, especially in the non-native areas. And they've actually started to outcompete the native fish species for food because they don't just eat mosquito larvae, they eat other insect larvae as well, and zooplankton, which has caused them to lead to lower populations of the native species, which in some of those areas they were introduced, they've actually been shown to be less effective at mosquito control than the native species. So kind of a false positive sort of thing where they thought, oh, mosquito fish, it'll eat a lot of mosquito larvae or whatever, really help lower mosquito populations, but it really hasn't done that much. And it not really making it any better than just having the native fish there and trying to promote the native fish, especially in areas that aren't in their native range. They may not initially recognize those different mosquito larvae. And in some of those areas, it's actually caused by reducing the native species has actually caused there to be more mosquito larvae. So it's kind of those areas, it's become a problem. They are, like I said, they are very small. So when you lose those low level predators, like those first level predators, you see you see the increase in things like your insects and kind of those first level consumers that are very small, like mosquitoes, can become a problem very quickly. But to control them, unfortunately, like I said, they're difficult to control. There are researchers trying to use actually like a robotic bass, a largemouth bass, to try to kind of frighten mosquito fish, kind of disperse them, prevent them from reproducing. But there's not a whole lot as far as if that is doing a lot to slow them down or not. So in their native range, they are actually very helpful, but in their non-native ranges, they're really not, because they're just pushing out the native fish and actually even some frog populations, because they probably compete with the tadpoles, which are one of, as those two things eat a lot of those insect larvae and even the adult mosquitoes. So losing those is a problem long term. But that is all I have on them. Kind of a short one, but is one of those. It may seem like a small topic, but it has big impacts over time.
Well, it seems like it was successful in some places.
Yeah.
Like it says, it seems like we used it, like Russia, Ukraine, or
Yeah,
even like Greece.
South America, but in places like Australia, it's had that opposite problem where they've actually been dubbed by some of the Australian scientists as one of the most problematic animals on the planet.
Well, they clearly haven't met cane toads.
Yeah,
Which are also a problem in Australia.
those are a huge problem. I was trying to save those for when we got to amphibians.
We didn't talk about them.
You just mentioned
put in
them.
their heads. They'll forget 6 months from now.
Maybe. We'll see.
Yeah, I have nothing else really to add, besides the fact that in some places they did actually work.
Yeah.
But in a lot of, it was the 2 or 3 spots that did work kind of outweigh the 6 or so other spots where it didn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, and the eastern and western mosquito fish look very similar. I think the eastern mosquito fish is a little smaller, maybe a little bigger, but they're not
It's a
quite
little bit
so
brighter.
Yeah, a little bit brighter.
More silverish yellow.
The tails are a little more narrow and have darker spots on them. But they were not used, or yeah, they've become also, they're invasive throughout the world as well. It seems like a lot of the invasive problems are in Australia and kind of those Southeast Pacific tropical areas.
I'd say it's just because they have similar, like,
They have a very similar niche to a lot of the native
yeah,
species of that size, and they're out competing them is the real problem.
yeah. And Australia and the U.S. have very similar, like, climates and stuff like that. But with that, that's all I had to add. I'll move on into my amazing species for the week. Alex already kind of covered it a little bit today. We're going to be talking about the Atlantic tarpon. And out of all of the species we covered today, this is one of the only ones that is actually on the IUCN Red List in a somewhat endangered state. They're only vulnerable at the moment, but they do have a decreasing population trend. So they are found in worldwide, give or take, mostly in the Atlantic.
Yeah, I was trying to pull up an image.
Yeah, the map's not exactly helping me on the IUCN website for their range, just because it covers it's such a broad range. But they're found throughout the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah,
there you go. Perfect. All that red area on Alex's map are areas you can find the Atlantic tarpon. And now, as we talked about, they are more surface species. They only go about 40 meters below the surface of the water. There has been no formal stock assessment of tarpon in any of its range. However, there's a lot of evidence to suggest there is a decline from historic levels. So total global landings of this species decreased 84.5% between 1965 and 2007. So we went from 4,600 tons versus 712 tons caught. But this was mostly in Brazil and mostly during the early years of that time period. So this can be more associated to a actual population drop rather than just a fishery trait.
So it seems the biggest issue is habitat loss for the juveniles. It seems to be the largest problem as far as
since they're found more inland in those more brackish coastal areas, a lot of like coastal housing and industrial development, like industrial docks and stuff like that, as well as like recreational activities, boats and stuff like just recreational boats, even commercial boats kind of play a big role into that, as well as like just the wastewater that comes in from the mouths of these rivers that feed into the Atlantic, whether it's human waste or agricultural waste, like the fertilizers, or like forestry runoff and stuff like that. And a lot of it is like internationally they're used as a sport fish, but locally they're more used for local medicine, that more natural healing, as well as local food populations. And we do have conservation efforts in part of the range, just because they cover such a broad range. They're not exactly decreasing in all of their range, but in the areas that we've studied, they do have a decrease. And there is like management processes and other things. We have bag limits in some of these southern states in the U.S. We have bag limits, 1 person per day. In Georgia, there's a $50 tag needed in Alabama to catch tarpon. And other places have size requirements before it's considered an actual sport fish.
Yeah, that's a lot of that. At least I know in the U.S., that's a lot of different fish species. If it's not over a certain size, you're not allowed to keep it. And even then, you have to have specific, I know in Pennsylvania, you have to have a trout license to specifically target trout, in addition to the generic fishing license for all other fish. And I'm sure it's similar with that in like a lot of those coastal states. They'll have an additional like stamp as part of your main license for like being able
like
to
a saltwater tag.
Yeah, like a saltwater tag, which is what you need to have if you're stopped by like the fish commission or whatever it is in the various states, and you don't have that tag, you can be arrested, fined. And they're usually fairly hefty fines, especially if it's something like this where it's a protected fish. And if you keep one and it dies, like, and you keep it to eat it or whatever, and it's under the size it needs to be, you're going to be in a whole heap of trouble. So that helps kind of conserve them in some ways, but of course there's a lot more fishermen than there are conservation officers in a lot of places, so it's hard for them to catch everyone.
Right. And that's really all I have. The species was assessed in June 2018 over a global assessment. And that was published in 2019. That's all I have to add. Alex, do you have anything else?
I do not know. I know one thing I wanted to add too, as far as some of the notes that were further down on this study. Most of them, like the males, don't really reach maturity until about 7 years, and then females closer to 10. I think that was about an average. So it does take them a while to get to that adult reproductive age and size, which I'm sure is also kind of causing that decrease in population, because you lose a lot of, with losing the habitat for the juveniles, and then it takes them that, losing juvenile habitat, it takes that long for them to reach adulthood. It has some compounding effects that really slow the population down.
Right. The study that I'm looking at has the population length being 12.7 years.
Yeah, that generation
they were
length.
using for their generation length. Yes. So I guess with that being said, that's all we have for the day.
Yeah, it's kind of a quicker episode, but a good one nonetheless.
Right. So I've been Tyler,
and I'm Alex. Don't forget to follow us on socials or Spotify. Follow us, leave us a rating. YouTube, subscribe, like the episodes. Facebook, Instagram, Life the Complete Story. TikTok as well, Life the Complete Story. We post a lot like on TikTok and Instagram. We'll do some like different amazing species throughout the week. Some little
clip or two thrown in there too.
Yeah, we throw some clips in there as well. And then Facebook, we put a little more like some articles we find that are interesting, but not really something we're going to cover on an episode, either just because they're long or they're not. As far as topical, we cover all range topics, so that part's not as much of the concern. It's just they're either very long or something that we just found super interesting that we wanted to share with you right away rather than having you wait.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we record on a Friday or something like that, and Alex or I finds an article on Monday. It's like, okay, well, it's not going to be relevant on Friday.
And then you can send us an email at Life Complete Story, all one word, or Life Complete Story, just Life Complete Story at Gmail. Leave us some comments. Let us know if you want to hear something specifically. If you find like an article or something that's really interesting that you want us to talk about, let us know. We would love to talk about more different things. Give us some ideas, even if it's something where we add like another segment of like listener questions that we can try to answer for you all. That'd be very fun.
Indeed, it would.
Yeah.
But as we always say,
keep learning. Learn something new. You never know what you'll find interesting.
Yep. Have a good one.
Yep. I've been Alex. That was Tyler. We'll see you next week.